What have we learned from 2020? Farmers would probably say, I sure don't want to go through another year like this one. 2020 was a year with little or no rainfall and streaks of 100+ degree temperatures during times that our crops were the most vulnerable to heat stress. No one had adequate irrigation resources to offset the prolonged periods of no rain and record high temperatures. But there are lessons we can learn from this year, and there are things we can do to adapt and somewhat lessen the impact when weather conditions are unfavorable. First on my list of lessons learned, it is critical to understand the relationship between yield goals and water demand. If you don't have a general idea of how much cotton a crop can produce with the water you have available, it is really impossible to make economically sound decisions when considering a change of course. By changing course, I am referring to abandoning a portion of a field and applying more water on the portion that was not abandoned, or diverting water from an unsustainable high water demand crop and applying more water to cotton. Second, plan for the worst, and if the worst happens, you must adapt quickly. Don't wait until it is too late to benefit from a change in plans. And third, there is always a yield correlation between water efficiency and yield performance. In our area, no one has adequate irrigation resources to compensate for inefficiency of a water system. Even in a wet year, our irrigation systems must be configured in such a way that we can get the most yield possible out of every inch of water that is applied. And last, I found that hand probing the soil and determining moisture availability by the field method is an invaluable and versatile tool in managing water. I will address each of these topics in more detail later in the presentation. I need to point out that the yield data in this presentation was generated using weekly irrigations at 30, 60, and 90% of potential evapotranspiration. The word weekly irrigations is very important, and being able to consistently deliver water to a crop at a percentage of PET is also very important in duplicating yields shown in the charts that will follow. Second, if irrigation intervals are greater than 7 days, yields will be lower than what I present here today. And the last guideline for understanding the data is the irrigation delivery system used to generate this data was a LIPA system. A LIPA irrigation system delivers water to every other furrow in a bubble spray pattern rather than in a broadcast spray mode. Yield reduction should be expected when less efficient irrigation delivery systems are used. I will go into more detail for each of these main talking points in subsequent slides. Understanding the relationship between yield and water. How much yield can you make with the water you have? As an example, let's assume that a grower overplanted cotton this year, hoping to receive assistance from rainfall in order to make the crop. Then no rain came, and now the grower is faced with the option of underwatering what was originally planted or abandoning a portion of a field and redistributing water to what is left. Wouldn't it be beneficial if you could estimate yields when adapting to such scenarios? By knowing this, you would more be able to make a decision on how much to abandon and how much to keep. So if a grower planted 100 acres of cotton and could only apply about 67/100ths of an inch per week, this would be close to about 30% of PET. It would require an irrigation capacity of close to 2 gallons per minute per acre. If irrigated acres was reduced by half, or only 50 acres out of the original 100, this would equal 1.3 inches of water per week that could be applied at 60% of PET. By reducing acreage 50%, this represents a capacity of about 4 gallons per minute per acre. So now let's look at yield potential. Yield goals versus water. Between 2009 and 2018, I conducted water use efficiency research for major seed companies located in our area. I selected 2012, 2013, and 2014 for the yield performance data presented here today, because these 3 years represent a dry year, a wet year, and a year that was in between dry and wet. When I say dry, wet, or in between, I am referring to rainfall that fell after first flower rather than season-long rainfall averages. Post-flower rainfall is what contributes most to cotton yields when irrigating at a deficit, and we all irrigate at a deficit. The yields reported are averages for 7 to 12 cotton varieties that were tested each year. I have looked at more recent water use efficiency data, and the results have fallen comfortably within the ranges reported between 2012 and 2014. The soil type for the Olton and Edmondson locations was Olton clay loam and Pullman clay loam. These two soil types have a soil moisture holding capacity of between 1 and 1.25 inches of water per foot that is available when at field capacity. There were 4 irrigation regimes in each one of these studies. The first is a rain-fed, as represented by the letters RF in the table. The rain-fed regime in all 3 years was not dry land. The rain-fed cotton was actually irrigated up until first flower, and then the irrigations were terminated. There was a range of 327 pounds of lint per acre for a low, up to 786 pounds of lint per acre for a high in the rain-fed regime. It is important to remember that cotton that relies solely on post-flower rainfall will have considerable yield variability from one year to the next. This is always the case for dry land or similar scenarios where yield is dependent on the rain that falls after first flower. The second irrigation regime was irrigated at 30% of potential evaporation, or 0.67 inches per week at peak demand. Yields in 30% PET range from 801 pounds of lint per acre to 1,067 pounds of lint per acre. You should notice that the spread between the lowest and highest yields were lower than what we saw in the rain-fed regime. Or another way to look at this is the 30% PET would yield about 801 pounds of lint per acre in somewhat dry year, and 1,067 pounds of lint per acre in a wetter year, and about 897 pounds of lint per acre on an average rainfall year. The third irrigation regime is 60% of PET, or 1.3 inches per week at peak demand. A low of 1,210 pounds of lint per acre and a high of 1,388 pounds of lint per acre was achieved. Please notice that once you consistently add water post-flowering, the variability between yields from one year to the next is less as compared to the rain-fed and the 30% regimes. Then the last regime is 90% of PET, or about 1.8 inches of water per week during peak demand. The average yield was 1,481 pounds of lint per acre for the 90% regime, and this was not much greater than the 60%. When irrigation exceeds 60 to 70% of PET, the pounds of lint per acre inch of water applied decreases. The data is telling us that the 90% regime represents too much water for the amount of growing season available in this region of Texas. Many growers like to think in terms of gallons per minute per acre rather than inches of water per week. The 30% PET is about 2 gallons per minute per acre, whereas 60% of PET is close to 4 gallons per minute per acre. I like to think in terms of irrigating at a percentage of PET. In this chart, I converted the amount of water available to irrigate a cotton crop on a weekly basis to a percentage of PET. The red cells in this chart represent irrigation levels below 30% and above 90% of PET. I do not have data on variety irrigation performance at levels below 30% of PET or at 90% or above. So if you have 200 gallon per acre irrigation capacity, you could irrigate 100 acres at 32% of PET. If you reduce the acreage by half, or 50 acres, you could irrigate at 66% of PET. Another example would be for pivots with a capacity of 300 gallons per minute. If you had 120 acres planted, you could be able to irrigate at around 39% of PET. If you reduce the amount of acreage planted from 120 to 80 acres, you would be able to irrigate at 66% of PET. So now let's look at what yields you could reasonably expect to achieve at these various PET levels. This chart represents general yields that could be achieved with different amounts of water. Much of this is extrapolated data. In other words, I use the 30, 60, and 90% PET yields to estimate the yield that could be achieved if cotton were irrigated, for example, at 46%. I will admit these numbers are probably only close and not based on irrigating specifically at each given percentage of PET represented in the chart. So if you were irrigating at 200 gallons per minute on 100 acres, this would be approximately 32% of PET, and the estimated yield would be approximately 924 pounds of lint per acre. If the acres irrigated were cut in half, you could now irrigate at 64% of PET and could expect yields of around 1,332 pounds of lint per acre. With 120 acres and 300 gallons per minute, you could be irrigating at 39% of PET and could expect yields of around 1,018 pounds of lint per acre. If acres were reduced from 120 to 80 acres, the PET irrigation levels would be 66%, and the crop could be expected to achieve around 1,332 pounds of lint per acre. One thing you need to remember is this: these yields were obtained with weekly irrigation intervals and were watered with a LIPA irrigation system. Changing the interval or watering with an inefficient irrigation system will reduce the yields I'm reporting here. So what are some of the logistics problems associated with irrigated cotton in 2020? Most growers had too much cotton and not enough water. Also, PET rates were much higher in 2020 than in previous years. I believe in the future, growers who tend to overplant and hope for rain should be prepared from the very start to abandon a portion of their acres if dry conditions prevail, and this should be implemented before the onset of first flower. In many cases, irrigation levels or irrigation intervals were too long. I have often said more water less often is better than less water more often. Although I still abide by this irrigation concept, there is a limit in the length of time between irrigation cycles before yields are impacted. The only way to achieve a shorter irrigation interval is to plant less cotton acreage or to water less acreage than you plant. Inefficient irrigation systems rob growers of potential yield every year. Increasing irrigation efficiency is like increasing pumping capacity. Broadcast spray systems are terribly inefficient, and growers should consider seriously changing to LIPA technology. The redistribution of water, or making the decision to abandon acres under drought conditions, should be made prior to first flower. Water use rates go up dramatically when cotton reaches the first flower stage. At peak bloom, cotton water use rates can range from anywhere between 0.28 to 0.31 inches per day or even more. Decisions to abandon acres prior to or just at the appearance of first flower increases the likelihood that soil moisture levels can be somewhat replenished before cotton water demand gets too high. Soil moisture reserve is crucial in obtaining top cotton yields. So what are some criteria that you should consider when abandoning a portion of a field? First, let me start by saying that planting more than you can irrigate at 30-60% of PET and counting on rainfall to make up irrigation shortfalls is a pretty good strategy in many years. But in a year like this, you have to be prepared to make adjustments. 3 criteria when considering abandonment of a portion of a field are as follows. Number 1, your inability to apply irrigations on a weekly irrigation cycle. Second, the inability to deliver adequate irrigation to achieve the desired yield goal based on the number of acres you have planted. Or last is the crop growth stage that the cotton is presently in when those decisions are being made. So we've talked a little bit about irrigation efficiency, and I want to review this a little bit more, comparing broadcast spray versus LIPA and why LIPA is more efficient. In broadcast spray systems, these are only about 50% efficient. And the reason is water is distributed across the entire profile, so there are higher evaporation rates. Also, there is less penetration of water into the soil profile when you spread that same inch across the entire soil profile. LIPA irrigation systems are about 80% efficient, and it's because water is concentrated in every other furrow rather than being spread over the whole soil profile. And because of this, there are lower evaporation rates, and also you can achieve deeper penetration of water into the soil profile with a LIPA system rather than a broadcast spray system. So what is the value of irrigation efficiency? We just discussed broadcast spray and LIPA. So on a broadcast spray system, we said it's about 50% efficient. A LIPA system is about 80% efficient. So that means in a broadcast spray, for every inch you apply, the crop benefits from only 1/2 inch. For every inch applied in a LIPA system, the crop benefits from about 8/10 of an inch. So if you say you irrigated a field 6 times after bloom, only 3 inches would be available to the crop in a broadcast spray system. The same 6 inches, if it were applied post-bloom in the LIPA system, you would have 4.8 inches that would benefit the crop. There's a net gain of 1.8 inches per acre. At 80 to 90 pounds of lint per inch yield per inch of water, that represents about 144 to 162 pounds of lint per acre gain just on efficiency alone. Considering reduced tillage systems. Reduced tillage systems takes advantage of rainfall and usually reduces the amount of pre-plant irrigation that is needed. Second, there is less evaporative loss when post-emergence irrigations are applied under reduced tillage systems. And last, there is a net positive gain in moisture available to the plants all season long when you have some type of cover over the rows that are being irrigated. Reduced tillage systems is an issue that many people are going to have to consider for the future. What hand probing the soil could have told you in 2020. Hand probing and determining moisture by feel is old technology, but it's still very, very useful today. By hand probing, you could determine the amount of water available to plants ahead of or behind the pivot. You could have also determined the depth to which water was penetrating into the soil profile. Hand probing can be used to calculate the number of days a given amount of soil moisture will last based on the water use of a crop at a specific time. Things yet to come, minimizing regrowth potential. At the time I prepared this presentation, there were a few fields that had an open bowl here and there. I do have a concern that we may end up with regrowth problems this particular year. Regrowth prior to defoliation can become a serious problem, especially in years like this when it's especially dry. Second, this situation is most common when cotton has gone through prolonged stress followed by rainfall in September or October. The water use rate for cotton remains fairly high right up to the first open bowl. These rates can be as high as 0.21 to 0.22 inches of water per day. Water is needed to mature upper position bowls. Most cotton has very little soil reserve moisture right at this particular time. So at first open bowls, it may be necessary to apply an irrigation or two more than you would expect to apply in a more normal year. Terminating irrigation prematurely can lead to regrowth problems. Thank you for your time and your attention.